What do you think, other than the EPBC, would be the big opportunity for Australia in terms of improving productivity, but also maintaining conservation of our environment?
There are two obvious policy instruments capable of providing price signals that deliver large land sector productivity benefits. The first is any and every initiative that delivers a higher price for Australian carbon credit units generally, but in particular, those initiatives that deliver a relatively low price for those ACCUs that restore natural capital. So that's the first thing. Further developments of the Australian carbon markets that preference interventions that restore natural capital. The second is the underwriting of marketable, and I stress the word marketable, biodiversity credits and similar instruments. And there is an opportunity that comes out of the reform of the EPBC Act that's quite tangible here, which is to have the restoration contributions holder underwrite the development of markets in biodiversity credits. So I would emphasise those two. Of course, there are other things that have come out of the EPBC reforms, and perhaps the most important, and it's also detailed in the table opening statement, is the development of regional plans or bioregional plans that allow government and the community generally to consider simultaneously environmental protection, environmental restoration, and developments that lift productivity in all sectors of the Australian economy.
Are you advocating a reform of the ACCU system which includes what's actually subject or what can be included as in an ACCU, as well as some of the broader issues around whether or not ACCUs can be more compatible with the sort of financial system, if you like?
Australia meeting net zero by 2050 is not going to happen unless there is a substantial increase in the utilisation of land-based ACCUs. Just can't see how it can happen. And the reason I say that is that all of the modelling that's been done by officials to date underlines that in order for Australia to meet net zero by 2050, it is very likely that the Australian landscape is going to have to sequester, that is, draw out of the atmosphere about 2.5 times as much carbon each year as it presently does. That's a mammoth task, but it's also a massive opportunity, because if you think about how that could possibly be done, it can best be done by revegetating, restoring the natural condition of the Australian landscape to some extent, obviously only to some extent. And we've done a large amount of modelling, and I know our colleagues at ClimateWorks are capable also of doing this modelling with their Luto 2 model. We've done a large amount of modelling which gives us confidence that there's certainly enough of the Australian landscape to be revegetated with environmental plantings that provides enhanced incomes for farmers on average across Australia, more resilient incomes because this is a diversification of farm income, and yet nevertheless retains the ability of the Australian agricultural sector to continue to produce more agricultural product year after year after year. So we're very confident that that can be done, but it does require a very substantial upgrading of ACCU supply. And of course, that supply is not going to be forthcoming unless there's a price that makes it commercially attractive for landholders to use their land for environmental plantings to create carbon credits rather than to continue to have goats grazing on it. So, that means that the demand for ACCUs also has to increase. And the likely source of increased demand for ACCUs is, of course, going to be the safeguard mechanism. And as you know, Chair, there's an imminent review of the safeguard mechanism coming up. But that review really has to generate a very substantial increase in the demand for ACCUs. And then the supply will be forthcoming and we can get nature repair as a consequence and enhance farm incomes.
And to riff on that a bit further, Chair, it's a beautiful moment when we can walk side by side with the NFF. Doesn't always happen, but I think we're on a pretty big unity ticket here. I think, what we've seen is an understandable but disproportionate focus in terms of the ACCU market on the demand side, insofar as understandably policymakers have wanted for a long time to keep the costs of acquiring ACCUs as low as possible to minimise the economic impact on polluters. And there's a bunch of understandable reasons for that. But what's been failed to be factored in has been the idea that ACCUs have to be supplied. You know, we need a supply of ACCUs to meet whatever targets a future government or existing government wants. And to date, the price is simply too low. The price is so low, and that is inhibiting a whole bunch of opportunities, both for policymakers but also for the farm sector, for the reasons that Ken's outlined. We need the prices higher so that farmers really have the incentive to manage their properties, both to do the more traditional activities in terms of food and fibre production, what have you, but also to do the things that they want to do, which is to manage their land well. And we need higher ACCU prices to achieve that.
In terms of actually getting the demand, I mean, I would have thought that the demand for ACCUs will be driven by organisations and a market which is interested in having exposure to low carbon or positive carbon, if you like, products. So isn't the supply side the most important component here?
The demand for compliance ACCUs, and that's the majority of the market, is coming only from one section of the economy, which is the industrial facilities that are covered by the safeguard mechanism, which represent, I think, something around 28% of the emissions that come from our domestic economy. As we reach for higher and higher targets, relying on just that section of the economy to create the demand, which therefore incentivises the supply, as you're saying, is going to become really tricky. This is why the safeguard review is so important. We want to see tangible benefits for landholders who carry a very big weight in terms of emissions reduction historically. We don't want to overcook, obviously, the people who are making the emissions, but we've probably got to have something better than what we've got right now, which is a singular reliance on 200-odd companies that are emitting more than 100,000 tonnes per year.
What mechanism should the Parliament consider enacting to give that sort of certainty about there are places you can go and there are places that you can't go?
The mechanisms are there. What we now need is the cooperation of all layers of government. So, you know, as you'll recall, through the passage of the EPBC reforms in December last year, new strengthened provisions to support regional planning have been built into the EPBC Act, and so there's two types of regional plans that are proposed. One is a thing called a guidance plan, which is, you know, not a statutory plan, but one that enables state and Commonwealth and local government to work with landholders and developers to, rather than look at each project approval or assessment and approval process site by site, to take it back to a larger landscape region and enable the ability to firstly identify the really important areas of high conservation value that should be protected, also to identify the areas where, you know, really light environmental assessments should be undertaken because the values of the land have been already recognised, and also this sort of happy medium place where you really want to start to prioritise restoration whilst having economic development underway. So that's a bioregional plan. The statutory plan is much more of a binding agreement between the states and the Commonwealth. They'll probably take longer just by the nature of sort of negotiations between different levels of government, which often take quite a long time. But so the tools are actually there. What we really need is the agreements to be in place between the two levels of government, between the Commonwealth and the states in particular, to set up a wave of regional planning processes. We need to make sure the funding's available. We need to make sure that the key stakeholders, particularly landholders and business, but also the local communities, are involved. So the instruments are actually sitting there. But what we need is the often impossible or at least difficult thing, which is the genuine cooperation by two levels of government in the pursuit of a national interest. So I don't know if we need more reform legislatively, but we need the commitment now, which is why the negotiations between the states and the Commonwealth regarding bilateral assessments and things like that are so important.
In what way do you see the net zero transition being productivity enhancing?
Essentially, it will provide a range of new commodity values for landholders. You know, like most of the country, most of our continent is managed under forms of extensive agriculture, particularly grazing. We obviously have substantial cropping areas as well, but most of the countryside is presently managed for grazing of various livestock, whether it be, sheep, cattle, goats, camels, all these various things that are wandering around the landscape. The costs of managing that land, which is also carbon rich and biodiversity rich and also productive, the cost of managing the land under present settings is extraordinarily prohibitive. It's very difficult for most landholders to imagine being able to try to sort of operate through the cycles of drought and flood and changing climate and managing ferals and, doing all the things they have to do, putting in place the farm infrastructure, all those things, by simply relying on commodity prices. It's just too difficult. One of the great opportunities that come from pursuing ambitious climate policies is not only do we make our contribution in trying to avert the worst of what's coming down the line with a warming climate, but we also have a way of incentivising climate-friendly and biodiversity-friendly activities. And the best biodiversity and climate-friendly activities we could be doing now is getting more trees and getting more vegetation back into the ground. From a purely agricultural science perspective, having more shade, having more trees in the landscape, holding the water in the landscape, all have tangible benefits, massive benefits. But when they're also storing carbon and building out the carbon stocks and building a sink of size and scale, it provides enormous opportunities. And if they can be lined up also with biodiversity objectives, that's incredible. So, what has net zero and what have climate policies in general done since, the early 2010s? They've created a commodity around a thing called carbon storage. And with the evolution of the nature repair market, which has been underway over the last, on a voluntary level for the last decade, but particularly through changes by the Australian Parliament for the last 2 or 3 years, we are also getting to a point where there will be a commodity value, a valuable commodity value attributed to protecting and restoring nature. These are enormously important at a productivity level because they're diversifying opportunities for farmers. They're delivering us a whole bunch of benefits in terms of emissions reduction and biodiversity protection. They're enabling farmers not to have to run their country so hard.
I might add, Senator, if we have time, and just stepping back as an economist and making the observation that whilst productivity seems like a rather complicated concept, it can be made very, very, very simple. When we're talking about productivity as economists, all we're talking about is making the best use of the time of the Australian labour force. That's all we're talking about. Because productivity, the way economists measure it, is simply output per unit of labour input. And the reason why that is a sensible construct is because output per unit of labour input is obviously what underpins the ability of the workforce to enjoy any particular level of real wages. More output per unit of labour input simply means that there's the capacity for increases in real wages and therefore the living standards of Australian workers. So it makes perfectly good economic sense to think of it in those terms. When you think about the connection between productivity and the natural environment, there are 3 things that stand out. I mean, there are many things we could talk about, but 3 things stand out. Firstly, business investment, which comes up in every discussion and it should come up in every discussion of productivity. We know that business investment decisions can be negatively impacted by poorly designed environmental interventions. Every business in Australia can tell you that. They can also be improved by well-designed environmental policies, and that's a large part of what we've been talking about so far today. Now, the second, which every business in Australia can also talk to you about, is that workers' time tied up not in producing output, but rather tied up in regulatory compliance. That's obviously also a drain on productivity. And that includes, obviously, environmental regulation that's uncertain or that's duplicative. And there is no better tool available to the Australian Parliament right now than regional plans in trying to address uncertain environmental regulation and duplicative environmental regulation. But the third, and the one that is often neglected, is that in thinking about output that can be produced per unit of labour input, nothing is more fundamental than the state of nature. And that's because the state of natural capital, the condition of natural capital, provides a foundation for everything else that humans do on this planet, including what they produce. The more degraded the natural environment, the more labour that must be used to sustain any particular output. But more worrying than that, more concerning than that, is that at some level of environmental degradation, no amount of labour input is capable of compensating. Put it another way, environmental constraints are immutable. If we breach too many of them, all production ceases, right? So it's kind of fundamental to underpinning the productive capacity of the nation. And we have not to date, as economists or as economic policy people, as governments in economic policy areas, we have not been good enough so far in developing programs and policies that ensure that natural capital becomes a driver of productivity rather than an accelerating drag on it.